Okay, so I guess we'll give it a minute before starting. Or Natalie, are you going to tell us when to start?
You can start whenever. The recording has begun, so whenever you're ready, whenever there's enough people here, you can get started.
Okay. So I'll give it a couple of minutes. Okay, I think we can start. We're recording, right? We'll post these later. So I am going to just share my screen here. Does that look okay? I can't see anybody anymore. Okay.
Yep, that looks good.
Okay, perfect. All right, so let's get started. So thanks everyone for joining us for the clinical prediction models talk. So my name is Krithika Suresh, and I'm a research assistant professor in the Department of Biostatistics and Informatics at CU Anschutz. And Katie, do you want to give a quick intro?
Sure, thanks. I'm Katie Colborn. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Surgery, and I also have a secondary appointment in the Department of Biostatistics and Informatics.
Okay, so I guess let's just get started. So I can't see where the chat went, so feel free to just interrupt if you have any questions, or Katie, feel free to hop in at any time. So I'm going to start off by giving a broad overview of predictive models as applied in clinical settings. So in healthcare, there's often interest in predicting a patient's future risk of a clinical outcome, such as disease or death. And part of that increased interest is a result of access to large data sets and electronic health records, which has really given us the ability to create and validate prediction models. And so this is just a very basic overflow of how a prediction model can look in a clinical setting. So you feed in a patient's specific information into the developed prediction model, and then it quantifies that patient's risk of the outcome. So it could be something like a predicted probability, a predicted time to the event, or even, predicted risk score. And the goal is then for this value to be used by the clinician to make important decisions about the patient's care. So such as which therapies to administer or what action should be taken for the patient. So in this presentation, we're going to go through a quick outline of the process of developing prediction models. We're going to talk about some of the statistical methods used for building these prediction models. And then we're going to talk about the importance and ways of assessing and validating them. And so then Katie's going to go through an example of the tripod guidelines for transparent reporting of prediction models. And hopefully you can see how all of these elements are applied in practice. So getting started, this is a very general framework for developing a prediction model. So there are three main stages identified here. So plan, build, and implement. So in my experience, both the statistician and the clinician are very involved in all of these three stages. So in the planning stage, we want to identify the goals. So what is the purpose of our prediction model? And we also want to start talking about the data. So we want to be able to assemble the data and talk about any issues that exist with it. And then we have the build stage, where we start to identify the model or algorithm we're going to use for developing a prediction model. And we're going to talk about assessing the performance of that model using internal or external validation. And then in the implement stage, the outputs of the prediction model are identified. So for example, do you want a predicted probability? Do you want a risk score? And so from that, we ideally want to be able to deploy these models, so make them available for people to use. And then in the event that you're using sort of a real-time model, we want to have continued monitoring of this prediction model over time to make sure that the performance is still adequate. And so all of these stages sort of feed into each other. So for example, when you're deciding what your expected outputs are, you sort of need to think about that when you're also developing your prediction model. So for example, if you're going to sort of have it deployed in real time, maybe you want to pick a prediction model that allows you to do that. So in this presentation, I'm going to go through a project I recently completed to sort of walk through all of these stages. So for this particular project, our goal was to predict prostate cancer specific mortality. And so the first place that we started was with a lit review. So actually the AJCC has this list of criteria for prediction models, so how the outcome should be defined, what procedures should be taken for validation. So since our goal was to develop a prediction model that was widely accepted in this research area, we needed to make sure that we satisfied all of these criteria in developing our prediction model. And also there are these tripod guidelines, which we will talk about later, but when you're sort of starting off with developing your prediction model, I would highly recommend taking a look at these early in project development to make sure you're following the necessary procedures. And then the other thing we looked at was what sort of existing prediction models are out there for prostate cancer specific mortality. And so there are actually a lot of prediction models in prostate cancer. And so we wanted to know what the gap was, because maybe if there are existing models and they're all doing great, then maybe we don't really need to develop a new model. We just sort of want to validate this model in our data set. So from the lit review, we found that the predictive performance of the existing models was not great. And then also the best performing predictive model was actually an AJCC score, which was based on expert opinion instead of being model based. So there was sort of a gap for potentially developing a really good predictive model that's based on a statistical model. And then also a lot of these prediction models were developed in smaller samples than the data set that we had available. And then also because the AJCC criteria may not have been available at the time, several of these models didn't go through this same procedure for developing the model. So based on all of this, we decided that there was sort of a gap that we could fill by developing and validating a model-based system for prediction of PCSM using a large multi-site data set with transparent reporting. So our next goal is we were going to assemble the data and prepare it. So we were able to get data from 10 centers. So we ended up with about 50,000 patient level data records. And so then thinking about the data issues, and there was a number of data issues that we had to address. So the first step was missing data. And so we had one variable that had a very high amount of missingness, so about 40% missing. And we had to decide whether we wanted to impute or not. And so actually we ended up not imputing in this case, but looking back on it, that is something that maybe I would have done differently. So kind of thinking about how you want to deal with that at the start. And then also we had, there was variation in the coding of several variables because we captured them from many different centers and then also over several years. So we sort of had to decide how to kind of consolidate that coding. And then also we found inconsistencies in the data. So for example, with Gleason grade, we found that our total Gleason was not actually always equal to the sum of the primary and secondary. So kind of thinking through how to deal with those data issues. And then the next thing to sort of consider at the start is how we're planning on validating the prediction model. So the idea is we have our training and validation data set where we build the model on the training data set and then validate its performance on the validation data set. And so at the planning stage, we really need to identify our plan for validation because it sort of will determine what data you use for that training. And also, kind of identifying whether you need to look for another data set if you're planning on doing external validation. So we actually ended up doing a split sample. So we split our data into a 50% training data set and a 50% validation data set. Again, there's a lot of literature on this, so maybe that's something potentially I would do differently in the future as well. And so the last thing, which I think is becoming more and more popular, is the transparency of reporting. So for this project, we actually developed a statistical plan for our entire prediction model process, and then we circulated it to all of the sites. And then we got feedback and we published it in our supplement when we finally published the manuscript. And also for transparency, we held our internal validation data set separately so that there was no question about whether we sort of peeked at it when we were doing the training procedure. And finally, we also included the tripod checklist as a supplement when we submitted our manuscript. And so once you sort of identified your plan, the build phase involves actually identifying the model or technique that you want to use, and then also how you're going to code the model and then assess the model using specific metrics. And then finally, we're going to talk about validating the model. So there's a large number of methods that you could use for building your prediction model. And so they start to fall along this data science continuum, where on the left-hand side, you have your more traditional statistical methods, so your regressions. And then on the right-hand side, you have sort of your more newer, fancier machine learning methods. So your neural networks, your deep learning. And so where you have this like trade-off being able to build a complex model that can capture nonlinear relationships in your data using a black box model that has limited interpretability, or you can have a very interpretable but simpler, maybe regression approach. And in the middle, you probably have something like your tree-based methods that are useful for classification and still have some interpretability. And so we're going to sort of go over in a little bit more detail these top three methods because I think they're probably the most popular. So starting with our regression methods. So the ultimate goal for these is we're trying to find a set of predictors that work well together to predict your outcome. So one method you might use is stepwise regression. So you might have heard of forwards or backwards selection. So for example, with forward selection, you sort of add in the best predictor one at a time into your model until you can't improve your model fit anymore. And so the idea is that you would expect this best fitting model to have good predictive performance. And so the advantage of this is it still gives you a slightly somewhat interpretable model because it's still in the regression framework. However, depending on whether you choose to use, forwards or backwards or some kind of like combination of the two, you could end up with very different models. And that's because the procedure is not testing every possible subset of covariates to find the best subset. So an alternative approach is penalized regression. And so the goal is still to find the best fitting model with the fewest covariates. And it accomplishes this in a little bit more of a stable and computationally efficient fashion. So a practical reason for wanting to do this covariate selection is sometimes it can be expensive to collect all of the inputs for a patient. And so also a statistical reason is that if you include too many covariates, you are sometimes in danger of overfitting. You can end up with models with high variance. And so you may have heard of, lasso, ridge, or elastic net. And so these methods include a penalty that penalizes the estimated coefficient values as they get further away from zero. And so each of these methods differ in how these penalties are specified, and you can sort of choose between them depending on your goal. So the advantages of these methods is that they all tend to have good prediction. And so with lasso and elastic net, they force some covariate estimates to be zero. So it allows you to perform variable selection as well as prediction. And some disadvantages. So ridge does not, it forces the estimates close to zero, but not actually zero. So it doesn't perform variable selection. And also with these methods, inference can be more difficult. So for example, lasso and elastic net will not, select grouped variables, the levels of group variables that are correlated. So, depending on what your ultimate goal is, maybe if it's just purely prediction, then, some of these issues may not be as relevant. And then something else you might have seen before are tree-based methods for prediction. So they iterate similar to what we'd seen with stepwise regression. So you start off with all of your patients in your top node. And then for every variable, you determine, every possible binary split. So for binary variables, that would just be, for example, male, female, yes, no. But for continuous variables, it looks at every possible threshold for dichotomizing that variable. And then it chooses the best variable and threshold combination using a criteria. And then it creates these two new nodes. And then it sort of iterates through that process until no more possible splits exist. And so coming back to our prostate cancer data set, so I only specified 2 levels. So the first level, it identified Gleason grade. And so you can see the first split is lower Gleason versus higher. And then in the lower Gleason group, the next split is PSA, and it shows this cut point of 12.3. And so at the end, you end up with these 4 nodes. And then you can kind of see the survival curves for each of the people in these 4 nodes. And you can see we have this far left node is a lower risk group, and on the far right, we have a higher risk group. And so the advantages of a tree-based method is that it's relatively easy to understand. So you can sort of look through the iterations of where the cut points are. And then it also helps identify these natural thresholds. So for example, we saw PSA being split at 12.3. And you can also see interaction. So we saw that there was a interaction between Gleason and PSA, and then also Gleason and percent positive cores. And so some of the disadvantages of this method is sometimes predictive performance can be poor, and then also they can be unstable. So if we even slightly change the data set, we might end up with a completely different tree. So there can be poor generalizations to a new data set. So to extend that, you might consider something called a random forest. So it's basically a collection of trees. And I would say it's one of the most popular machine learning algorithms because it's easily implemented in software. And it's also a very powerful method for estimation. So it's an ensemble method. The idea is you select a random sample of your data and a random sample of all the possible covariates, and you fit a tree to that data set as we've done before. And then you sort of repeat this several times. So for example, 1,000 times. And then for each person that you want to make a prediction for, you get their prediction for each of these 1,000 trees, and then you average them across to get a prediction for that person. So the advantage of the random forest is it can be used for both regression and classification tasks. And then also you do get some interpretation from this method. So I've shown here on the right a relative variable importance plot. So you can see which variables are important. So we see that Gleason percent positive cores are important, but maybe age and node stage was not important. And this sort of helps you drop features that maybe don't contribute to the prediction process or can be used in sort of making those clinical decisions. And so the benefit of the random forest over the tree-based approach is that with enough, trees, you won't overfit as you would with a tree-based method. But the disadvantage is that it can be slow with a large number of trees, and so could potentially be ineffective if you're doing real-time predictions. So people input their information and they want to, prediction, they want that pretty fast. And also it's not a very descriptive tool. So we do have the variable importance, but it's not telling you in which direction the coefficients are associated with the outcome. And so, there's a lot of, methods you could use for developing your prediction model, but the main question is, what method do you use? And so, 3 possible things to consider are, the size, quality, and nature of your data set. So if you have a large number of predictors, but a small sample, you might want to consider something like penalized regression. Also, what do you want to do with your data? So if you're interested in creating risk groups, a tree-based method might be the way to go. Or if you want to use your model also for inference, then you might want to choose a regression method. And then also the available computation time. So if you just don't have the computational resources, then something like a random forest or even something more complicated than that might not be feasible. So overall, the aim is you want to match your method to your goals. So if you want a parsimonious model, so you don't want to include a lot of predictors, you might want to consider something that performs variable selection, such as the lasso. But if you want a more interpretable model, then, you know, maybe you also want to look at some of these regression-based models. So overall, though, the choice of the model might not be as important as getting some of those basics right with, you know, your data processing and considering confounders and if there's censoring present, et cetera. So sort of when you've decided what set of models you're going to look at, we're going to look at what kind of metrics you want to use to assess the predictive performance of those models. To start off, you might want to consider discrimination and calibration. So discrimination refers to the model's ability to distinguish between those who are low risk and high risk. So if you have two people and one has the outcome and one does not, does your model give the person who had the outcome a higher predictive probability? And so this is most commonly measured using AUC, also C-index, where a higher value is better. And so I've included some of the models that we actually looked at for this project on the right. So we developed a score-based model, and then also we included a model based on stepwise selection with interaction terms. And then we included the AJCC score model. And then finally, we did a random forest. And so you could, you know, the reason to also look at calibration is you could have a model that does great in discrimination, but then tends to just predict high for everybody. And so calibration looks at the agreement between your predicted probabilities and what was observed. So in this plot here, we have a calibration plot where on the x-axis, we have the predicted probability from the model. And on the y-axis, we have the proportion of people who actually had the outcome. You want to sort of line up on this 45-degree line. And so the other thing you can also look at is overall measures of prediction errors, so such as Breyer's score. And, you know, I think the most common question is, well, what is a good value for all of these metrics? And so to provide a comparison, you could use something like a null model that doesn't have any covariates, or you can look at other alternative predictive models that exist in that field. So for example, we included this AJCC model. And so, you know, the final step of the build phase is validation. So there's three types of validation. So we have a parent validation where you just evaluate the performance of the model on the same data that you used to develop the model. So this is the easiest to do, but it also will give you a very optimistic estimate of the performance. And so, you know, the other options are internal validation. So where you evaluate the model on a sample from the same underlying population. And so you can use something like a split sample where you split into a test and a you know, training data sets, or you could use cross-validation or bootstrapping where they take samples of your data and then test on individuals that were held out from that sample. And so for our project, I just wanted to show you sort of the apparent and internal validation results. So this is again AUC. So you can see that, you know, something like a random forest, it does great in your, you know, apparent validation, but then when you look at internal validation, does just about the same as the other methods. And so, you know, again, you know, having a comparison method is helpful. So having what's existing out there, which is the AJCC score, also gives us a gauge of if we're doing better than what's already out there. And then finally, there's external validation where you evaluate the performance on different populations. So if you train on a specific set of centers and then validate on a completely different set of centers, or you can do it over different years, or, you know, somewhat different therapies or different variable definitions. And so, so we did have an external validation data set. So we had a Sierra data set, so we were able to include that as well. And then just so, you know, very briefly, I just wanted to talk about outputs from your model. And so some people, you know, are only really thinking of predictive probabilities, but there's several things you could include. You could include a nomogram, point estimates. For tree-based methods, you could include the tree, so people can, you know, drop themselves down to see where their risk is. And then so, you know, I think something that's kind of gaining traction are these web-based applications. So something like you input your information and then you in real time see some information about your risk. And so, you know, there's just an overall summary where I touched very briefly on a lot of the areas of predictive modeling, but all of these, you know, take substantial thought and input from both the clinician and the statistician. So I think as more big data becomes available and more machine learning algorithms continue to be developed, I think this there's going to be a lot of, you know, improvements and extensions in this area. All right.
Okay. Thanks, Krithika. That was great. I'll share my screen. We just have a short activity, so this we know we only have 10 minutes left, but mostly our activity is just to introduce you to some things to think about and look into as you're considering developing and or validating a prediction model. So many of you are probably familiar with the Equator Network. This is where you find really great resources like how do I construct a consort or a strobe diagram, consort relating to clinical trials, strobe being sort of a diagram to say, who did you include in your observational data analysis? And then there are things for if you're doing a meta-analysis. So lots of great guidelines out there. And it's always something where they've assembled a team of experts to come up with these guidelines. And so Krithika and I thought it would be good, since she had mentioned the tripod guidelines, these are the transparent reporting of a multivariable prediction model for individual prognosis or diagnosis. And this was a team of experts that were assembled, and actually the guidelines they came up with have been published in over a dozen major medical journals. They're supported by most major medical journals. There's been a number of additional articles about these guidelines and how they should be used. And so this website is a good place to go if you want to find resources related to this. So as you're thinking about developing and validating a model, most people for major journals will want to see what's called the tripod checklist. So if you're just developing a model, there's a PDF or Word version. If you're doing only validation, there's a checklist. And then for both development and validation, there's also a checklist. And you can download these, and typically you want to include those in as supplementary material in your paper when you're publishing your results. And then there's actually a tripodstatement.org where you can learn more about the articles that have been published, the checklist, their original statement. And you can go to, if you just go into PubMed and search many different articles. So this is BMJ's version, Annals of Internal Medicine have a version, JAMA has a version. But here's just kind of the introductory paper. And what's nice is they talk about the checklist, which you can download there. And then they also show you sort of this diagram of different types of designs of your prediction models. So Krithika introduced you to all the different ways that you can design this. But then there are trade-offs, as she mentioned, for different designs. And sometimes you have limitations about your sample size in terms of which approach you can take, but they sort of create this hierarchy here. So you have like a type 1A up to a type 4. And I'm going to show you an example of a paper that Krithika published with her colleagues, where they had a very robust development and validation of a clinical prediction model and included the checklist. And so you can kind of match that up with which design they chose in one of the papers. So there should be a link in your materials. We could probably provide this paper to people as well who have registered, but you should have access through your academic library to this JAMA Oncology paper. And along with this publication is the supplementary material where you have the checklist. And it's not very exciting to look at. I mean, it just tells you which page the certain criterion are on in the publication, but it's very useful exercise to go through and say, okay, where did they describe the eligibility criteria for participants? If I go to page 5, like, how do I need to do that in my paper? And if we're reading through this and thought, oh, now did they use an internal or an external validation? It's easy to go back and and find these things. And as a reviewer, this is very useful because some reviewers have more expertise working, even as statistician reviewers, some have more expertise in prediction models than others. And so the point of this guideline is to help you understand how this model was developed and validated and whether it was robust. And so this one does both an internal and external validation. So I encourage you to read this paper and this checklist to see sort of how this is put into action. So that, I mean, we don't really have much of an activity, but we're happy to answer questions related to that. And then hopefully that checklist and paper would be useful to you. Feel free to either speak up or put it in the chat. I don't know if you have the ability to speak up, probably. It's getting near the end of the day.
Thank you both so much. That was really interesting. There's a question here in the chat from Jeremy. For models developed from observational data, would it be common to submit both strobe and tripod checklists?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I am actually in the middle of writing a paper right now where I've developed both a strobe diagram and the tripod checklist. I mean, the checklist is meant to kind of help serve as the strobe diagram, but the checklist is not necessarily, well, it's independent of your study design, essentially, although most prediction models use observational data because they aren't clinical trials. So you certainly can. I don't know if it's required. Do you know, Krithika?
I don't think I've submitted the strobe one in the past with the tripod, but I guess I don't see the harm, right?
Yeah, I think of the strobe as something I would put in the main part of the paper, and then the checklist might go in the supplemental materials.
So, in the context of pragmatic research, we thought that, clinical prediction models might be a particularly relevant concept because we're thinking about how do we make use of data collected in real world care settings? How do we bring value to that data, to that information that's collected about patients and use it to inform care? Can you talk a little bit about sort of the pragmatic aspects of computing, of validating, and ultimately implementing prediction models like this?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, go ahead.
I can answer. So I think there's a lot of different uses. So you see a lot of people in centers for personalized medicine utilizing data in real time. So as sort of a decision aid, a clinical decision tool, so that you can make use of that information while you're sitting there with the patient. And so sometimes that's something really critical for avoiding a mistake, like drug interactions. But then other times it's more about, okay, how can I inform the patient a little bit more about maybe their risks? So we actually have a colleague of mine in surgery developed something called the Surgical Risk Preoperative Assessment System, or SURPASS. And this is integrated into the EHR. And it was developed actually fairly simply using logistic regression, and it only requires 8 variables. But the model has very high discriminative ability for identifying patients at high risk of postoperative complications. And so what they do is the surgeon puts in the 8 variables and it prints out the patient's risk compared to the national average from a data set of more than 7 million patients. And so it's useful for the patient, even if when you give a patient a predicted probability, it doesn't mean a whole lot to them unless you can kind of say, hey, but here's the national average. So are you above that or are you below that? And I think putting these prediction models into context for patients is really important when you're trying to implement these models. Krithika, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's, exactly right. So I kind of, glossed over some of the clinical decision-making aspects of this, but, as I mentioned, like the statistician and clinician are, highly collaborative in this whole process, because the goal would be, we develop these prediction models, but we want them to be able to be used in practice.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing, that it's a distinction that they make in these tripod guidelines is models for prognosis or diagnosis. And the example I gave you with Surpass was a prognosis model. So what can you tell the patient about what you think might happen to them after this operation? Whereas I do more of a data mining exercise with my current RO1, where we're developing prediction models, but they're used to actually find information from the EHR in order to diagnose a patient. So can we look back at the data and say, did this patient experience a surgical site infection, given what we see in their chart, without having a nurse have to do manual chart review, right? So can a computer do that? And that's still a prediction model, because you have maybe a gold standard data set where you're comparing it to, but that would be more for the purpose of diagnosis than prognosis.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you both so much. And we need to transition at this point. I'll let you answer Jeremy's question. But those of you who do not want to stay for causal inference in emulated trials and want to go do something else, this would be a good opportunity to transition. But you can go ahead and answer Jeremy's question about the learning curve for developing Shiny apps.
I guess depending if you have experience with coding in R, it could be not too bad. There's a lot of examples, and usually, when I create a Shiny app, I start with, there's a wide host of example like code that you could start off with. So kind of taking a look at their website and seeing like, oh, well, I kind of like the look of this one. You can download the template and start there. But I would say that you do need to have experience with coding in R to be able to code your prediction model into that. Would you say that's right, Katie?
Yeah, and honestly, I've actually worked with both an undergraduate student at CU who was a math major, and he developed one last year for the governor's modeling team that I was on. And then this semester, an MPH student developed one. So if you know some basic R and you're eager to learn, it's not too bad. And if you want to collaborate with the biostat department, there's always MPH students who need a practicum project. So if you're at the University of Colorado, that's an option.
Yeah, so I just sent, a link for some example ones if people are curious for what those look like.
Yeah. Holden Scott.
Thank you so much.
All right.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.